Well, welcome everybody to our latest installment of Innovative Church Conversations, which is the title I've given these because I didn't know what else to call these conversations. But it's because we're trying to talk about what do we need to innovate for the church to engage 21st century North America. So these are for Mission Alive church planters. We've got several board members on here today, other people that are kind of part of the Mission Alive world and working at the intersection of the kingdom of God and the world and their communities. So glad you guys are all on here. I suspect everybody on here knows who Dr. Reed is, but let me give you just a quick introduction to Dr. Carson Reed. He is Vice President of Church Relations at Abilene Christian University. He is the Executive Director of the Cyber Institute and directs the Doctor of Ministry program, as well as holding the chair for Fraser Chair for Church Enrichment. So did I get it all, Dr. Reed?
That's plenty.
You don't want me to add anything else to that?
That's enough.
Okay, because here we go. He has a bachelor's degree in English. He has an MDiv from Harding and a DMin from ACU. And the thing that has fascinated me as I've interacted with Carson over the years, his own personal interest in practical theology and the engagement of faith and culture. And it was in that conversation a couple of years ago that he introduced me to this book that I've mentioned to many of you, Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil. His experience and his knowledge about this engagement between faith and culture goes way beyond this book, but that book has been an important book for me and several of us in Mission Alive in the last year or so. So I wanted to invite Dr. Reed to join us, let us pick his brain a little bit and just hear what he has to say about into the future of the church in North America. So Carson, welcome. And thank you for carving out some space.
Glad to be here. Glad to be with you guys.
I'd like you to start by just sharing a little bit of your own spiritual journey. Kind of where do you come from? Where have you been? What have you done? How has God used you over the years? Give us a little context.
Yeah, I grew up as a preacher's kid, or a PK, and in many respects that was a good thing. And it also inoculated me against thinking that I wanted to be a preacher myself. And I fought that mightily through my college years and fell under the tutelage of an English professor and ended up majoring in literature and went to law school, actually. Even though I was preaching for little churches all over central Oklahoma and Kansas on the weekends, I was not going to be involved in congregational ministry. I'd seen way too many people get beat up. I'd seen ignorance. I'd seen mean-spiritedness, and I just didn't want any part of all of that. But during law school in Topeka, Kansas, a place called Washburn School of Law, I had a winter experience on a very snowy winter day in Kansas, where I realized that I was going to be a minister, and I think God would have let me go on and be an attorney, but I felt deeply a call, and so I left law school and went to Memphis, Tennessee, and began work on an MDiv there. I often think about my calling into ministry as sort of the Jonah story. I think we all have different prophets or different figures in the Old Testament we may relate to. Mine would be Jonah. I didn't want anything to do with anything that had to do with the church as I knew it, but felt, again, deeply a call that my job was to make something different out of what I had of the abuses and the stupidity and the smallness that I'd seen. And fell in love with seminary education. And it was there that I probably had my significant spiritual awakening, mostly through the tutelage of a professor there by the name of Doug Brown, who probably no one knows. He didn't last very long in the Harding system, and he's now passed away, I think. I've been trying to track him down here lately, which opened up the tradition to me that Churches of Christ were not the only folks. There's people have been following God for a long time. Opened up the tradition in the sense of prayer, and opened up a way of seeing Scripture in all kinds of new ways. There was just a lot of awarenesses there that happened for me that suddenly I saw that there was a place for me in ministry and a place for the church in the way the church was invited to be partnering with God. It was, though this is really before missional theology had hit, I'm that old, this was in the mid-'80s, I was already being prompted to think in new ways about what congregational life ought to look like. And so I did so well that my faculty said, go do a PhD. And I said, okay. And then they said, but first you need to spend time in congregational ministry. So I was married, my wife and I, we moved to Indianapolis and spent 20 years in 2 churches in Indianapolis serving. And it was there in the rough and tumble of congregational ministry that I fell in love with what ministry can be, and let go of the dream of doing a PhD, which would have meant disengaging from ministerial life, and where practical theology actually emerges out of the lived experience of God's people. We had 4 children during that time, which was a significant formative thing for me. I'm a 5 on the Enneagram, and kids tax me, doggone it. And the Lord taxed me mightily. And we lost 2 children during that time. There were lots of ups and downs that were part of my formative life in the 80s and early 90s. After 20 years of ministry there, I spent about 10 years in ministry in Atlanta, Georgia, and in 2012, made the move to Abilene. I was asked to come. They said, we need somebody to teach practical theology. And I said, well, I'm a practitioner. I'm not an academic. And they said, that's exactly what we want. We want you to come as a practitioner. And so for 8 years, I've been here. I'm kind of rambling here, Todd, but maybe that gives you some sense of my journey. I find myself deeply rooted both in congregational practice and life, as well as academic engagement, and try to keep my feet in both of those places and try to find ways to bridge those increasingly what is a gap. I think that real theology takes place in missional life and missional communities, in churches, in the rough and tumble of life. It does not, that's where theology is forged and emerges. And so I respect the work that each of you are doing in congregational and ministerial contexts. Those are lively places where God is at work. Yeah, is that helpful, Todd?
Yeah, that's great. I think it's helpful to kind of hear your spiritual journey, and it frames you up not just as an academic, but as kind of one of us. You've kind of walked the many similar journeys as everybody on here as practitioners. So, and it's that intersection of both practical ministry and the academic world that I think holds us together in many ways, and why we want to have these conversations. We want to be well-informed practitioners. So thank you for your time today. I know that you get to interact with leaders from all over the world. You and I have spoken about conversations and interactions you've had with leaders of seminaries from many parts of the world. I think you've recently announced a partnership with a seminary in Australia, if I recall. Right. And I recently heard this new chair of Baptist studies that you've opened up there in Abilene. So because of your exposure and your interaction with lots of people, I'd like to ask you, what do you see on the horizon? What do you see about North American and Western Christianity that leaders need to be aware of, a perspective maybe that you are beginning to see emerge that we need to know about? What would you share with practitioners?
Great question, though I suspect that many of you in this room are already very aware of these things. We are in a time of, in the Western world, I think a time of decay with established Christianity. I think mainline traditions are in significant decline. I think those of us who are connected to Stone Campbell traditions, many of those churches are in significant decline. And there are a lot of factors that play into that. I think the rise of secularity is a part of that. The fact that we're living in a time now that is unlike perhaps any other time, where persons can postulate and live out a life, a worldview without God, and it be a perfectly acceptable thing. That's never happened in human history. Even the ancient peoples believed in some sort of God, for crying out loud. But now in Western world, you are deemed to be completely sane and normal if you claim to be an atheist, or you don't even, why would you even make that claim? You just live in a material world. And that Christianity has never had to deal with before. And that's a big factor. And the person that I think speaks to that most clearly, I was looking to see if I had a copy of this book around me. I don't. I think it's in my office. Is a book by Andrew Root called Pastor in a Secular Age. And I would highly recommend to those of you to take a look at that. If you have access to, I did a review of the book recently for Theology Today. It's a journal published by Princeton, which is a little, I'm getting eggheady for just a second. But that 2 or 3 page review would give you a look into the book. That secularity is driving a lot of what's happening in our culture today. Charles Taylor is a noted Canadian philosopher, is one who's probably articulated that the most. So if you're familiar with the work of James K.A. Smith, then you're seeing Smith actually is appropriating Taylor and his popular work like Root does. Root is doing it for the church. And I would, so that's why I commend his work to you. So secularity, the rise of the nuns, I'm sure all of you are aware of that we've got now probably 3 out of every 10 persons under the age of, I'd have to go back and look at numbers, under 30 or 35, just simply have no connection to any kind of organized religion. One of the concerns I have is that many church leaders look at that and think, well, then they're not interested in the church, they're not interested in spirituality. Secular people, although they say they don't believe in God or they're not really have an interest in postulating a God, still have this vague spiritual hunger that is present and a longing for what Root and Taylor would call a haunted or enchanted world. And therein probably lies one of the great places where we have points of connection with, in terms of thinking about our mission and purpose, is that place of that haunting or enchantedness. I think another factor that's playing itself out right now is generally an anti-Christian bias that exists in our culture. I say bias, there's plenty of evidence to point to this. Christians are anti-phobic, they're racist, they're, what else are they? They're just intolerant. There's there's a lot that's been kind of piled up on Christianity, some of which we've brought on ourselves, but nonetheless, the barrier between the effort to live out the mission of God grows, often by the fact that Christians have often done stupid things. So that's another factor that's playing itself out in our culture that church leaders, church planners, and others have simply got to be able to navigate. So I'm rambling again, Todd, so let me hush up there. Those are some things that come to mind.
Does that raise any questions from anybody? I happen to have Taylor's book sitting right next to me. If anybody is interested. Now, this is a beast.
Turn it the other way. There you go.
It's a beast.
Read
A. Smith, who has a Cliff Notes version of this that I'm about halfway through, and it's a little more accessible. So, but good stuff. Thanks for
that's a way to go. Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about this book, Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil. I don't have the dust jacket here with me, but so talk to us a little bit about the value you see in this book. I know you've used it in at least one of your classes. What's been the value that you have found in this work?
Well, what Chris James does is sort of a model of what, because I teach and direct a Doctor of Ministry program, he's doing the kind of work that we take mid-career ministers through. And by that, I mean, he's doing both demographic, qualitative research into a problem, but he's also doing deep theological reflection, which is more what you may have done in graduate school. But he's bringing those things together in a wonderful marriage. And so in terms of the work itself, it has a great deal of value as a model of good, what I think is good research that serves the church well. Its value is that by taking the city of Seattle and identifying 150 churches that were planted since 2000, this discrete group, he's been able to, which is a very secular context, perhaps one of the most secular contexts within North America. He's raising up for us an environment that no matter where we're at in America, we can at least, if we don't relate to it well, we will within the next decade relate to it well. And out of that, he's giving us a microcosm of church vitality, these church plants and various sorts of frameworks that are doing a marvelous kingdom work. And so we're able to kind of get up close and see on the ground the kinds of things that are happening. And what I like about that is that although we all might have our favorite way of how we ought to think about church or ecclesial identity, what James is offering to us gives us multiple models to look at. And that sort of, I think, is a proper sort of chastening for us to think that not all of us have to be just like somebody else, that there is a plethora of models that exist, and that we need to be humble enough and reflective enough to look at our own particular context, our own theological frames, and be able to not think that there's one simple model that we need to follow. So those are some things that I think are particularly helpful about the book. It's theological reflection, its breadth of demographic work, and then the sort of models that he begins to postulate that give us some ways of having conversations ourselves about our own contexts.
Hey, as you guys may have seen, I posted in the chat room that you're welcome to post any questions that you have, and I'll call upon you at the appropriate time. I'm gonna ask Alan to go ahead and articulate his question and see what Dr. Reed has to say, and then we'll keep moving.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Reed. My question is there hope for the mainstream church, and in my context of the Church of Christ, going forward and and can that church partner with the church planting movement to work together?
Well, that's a good question, Alan. I wish I had clear enough vision to see out to have an answer for that. I don't have, I'm not, I'm not overly optimistic really about churches of Christ as they are today. I am very optimistic about God, and I'm very optimistic about kingdom, and I'm optimistic that, and I believe that there are assets within the Stone Campbell tradition that are actually very helpful. There are also some fatal flaws that exist within there are some dark places that trip us up a bit. And I'm reflecting right now, I've got a doctoral student who's leading about 70 churches of Christ in Australia. Now, these are not American churches of Christ. These are a little different version, but they're struggling with a similar thing that many churches of Christ struggle with. And one of the things that we've been talking about is, for example, is a lack of understanding what really is at the core of our faith. And so we don't have a creed. We've been against creeds. Well, by being against creeds, we've never positively said what we do believe. And so whenever we have a little debate, everybody says what is right in their own eyes, and we never have a place by which to begin to anchor. We'll say, well, there's no creed but Christ. Well, that works well until we begin to actually move forward on our understanding of Christ. And so in some ways, that's it needs to be a corrective in our heritage to help us tie ourselves to the larger tradition, even to reconnect to some of the better parts of our tradition that would be helpful to us. So I'm rambling a little there, Alan, but I'm not, I think the short answer is I don't really know, but I think there are assets that exist within the Stone Campbell tradition that can be leveraged for church planning. And in fact, I think we can bring gifts to the larger church planning movement or movements. I would want to put an S on that. I'm not sure which movement we'd be talking about, but this impotence, this kind of missional impotence that is present in lots of Western contexts, we've got a place at the table that I think we can play with humility to bring some things to the table. So there's a book just published that I think that would speak to this by John Mark Hicks, Mark Powell, and Greg McKenzie, whose title, Todd, you're nodding your head, yes, maybe somebody can post it for us. The theology, discipleship and theology, something. Just, thank you, discipleship and community, that would highlight, I think, many of the things that we bring to the table. I've got a brief chapter review inside that book where I am articulating some of what I guess I'm trying to say here, Alan. So those are some thoughts along those lines.
John Mark Hicks, Greg McKenzie, and who else is the other author on that?
Mark Powell.
Powell.
He's at Harding grad school,
Yeah.
Harding School of Theology.
Yeah. All right. So let me ask a follow-up question about this book, Church Planting in Post-Christian Soil. It's set in with a premise that as Seattle goes culturally, so goes the rest of the country. And you are indicated that there's some level of agreement you have with that premise. How do you evaluate that as a premise for other parts of the country?
Yeah, I would have been more apt to be agreeable to it if it weren't for something that we're calling the pandemic. So I have a little hesitation to think that everything that happens in Seattle is going to happen in Dallas. But I think for those of us who are thinking about the growing edges of the kingdom or at the margins, or thinking about unchurched peoples, then I think what the argument that he makes, that what we find in Seattle helps us, is valuable, is significant. The caution that I have is that I think that even though 90% of all churches are in decline, maybe even higher than that, established churches are still going to be around for a while. The wild card is, what is the pandemic doing to us? It'll be another 2 or 3 years before we know. We're right in the middle of a bunch of liminal space right now, it seems to me, that we're just having to navigate. I was in a meeting just an hour or so ago, and somebody was saying, well, what are we going to do in September? And I says, I don't know. We'll wait till September to figure that out. We're living literally day by day. Each day has enough trouble on its own. And there's a certain, I would like to think there's a certain joy to that we need to embrace as people of God, to simply live in the moment and be faithful in the moment. So there are some a little bit of concern I have around that claim that he makes, but by and large, I think it's one that we need to take seriously and pay close attention to the models that he develops and the way in which he articulates the strengths and weaknesses of those various models.
That may be a good setup for Andy's question. Andy, jump in here with your question, your first one.
Yes, Dr. Reed, I appreciate you being with us today. And come back, Chris James, I have not read that book, but obviously presenting the multiple models from things that you have looked at around the world, and certainly in our Western context. Do you feel that in our Western culture, are we ready for like micro churches or missional communities? Do you see us drifting that way as like the global South has in many ways?
Yeah, except I don't think we'll drift. I think it'll have to be intentional. I'm playing with words a little with you, Andy, but the drift will be to decline. The intentional thing will be people and communities of faith who intentionally begin to embody and inhabit space, local spaces, neighborhoods, I think. I think the answer to that question is a little mixed. I think in some ways we're living both still in a time of Christendom, where church is a thing you go to, right? And you go to a big church and you see a big show, and there's lots of programs and there's lots of resources there. That kind of church is still going to be with us for a long time. And praise God for that, I would say. But I think what we're going to see is the rise of micro communities, as to use your language. We're going to start to see local neighborhood expressions of ecclesiality begin to emerge, because people who are secular, who don't really believe in God, are certainly not going to drive 45 minutes across the Metroplex to go to your program. But they might come to a Bible study at your house at 7 o'clock and have a glass of wine around your swimming pool. Or they might be willing to get with you and go and on Fridays and feed homeless folk. And in other words, it'll be the concrete and local expression of life and faith and shared life and hospitality and service and care for the poor, et cetera, that will draw people, particularly people who don't have a whole lot of old school church as a part of the way they envision life. So we're kind of in this mixed space where established churches are going to continue, some will continue to thrive, others will be in a slow, gradual decline, some are in a steep decline. Big churches will still be around, but we're also going to see the rise of lots and lots of new, what I call ecclesial forms, including, hey, we're just going to move and live and be in this 6-block area of Fort Worth, and this is where we're going to plant, and here's where we're going to be. This is where we're going to eat our meals and do our ministry and get to know our neighbors and get involved in local politics. Not at the national level, whatever happens at the national, that's fine. But we're going to make sure the streets are clean in our neighborhood, and we're going to work with the mayor or the local councilman to make sure that the folks who are poor in this neighborhood do get the social services they need. It'll be much more local and contextually rooted. Is that helpful, Andy? It's portable both ends.
Yeah, and I think those local expressions of faith, that's a paradigm shift for those of us that in the church. Of course, we're doing that here in Orlando, but only because another congregation had great vision to support us in this effort. And I'm finding I work with a lot of, millennials, but also Gen Z. The college students I work with, they're still just 18, 19, 20. And they see that they are open, they're ready regardless of their upbringing and background. They just want to be in the Word. They want to grow spiritually. And I have a lot more hope for that generation than I do even some of the millennials.
Right. And they'll be willing to make the turn, I think, to make choices. When I was my last years in Atlanta, we began to invite university students when they graduated to move to Atlanta. We helped them get into an apartment in the middle of, it was Clarkston, Georgia, which was the home of about 81 different language groups of refugees from all over the world, a massive resettlement zone. And we said, hey, come do ministry and start your career here. And they're like, sure, why not? Atlanta, well, I can find a job there. Ministry, sure. And those 21-year-olds were ready for an adventure into a missional living. And so this is where established churches who have some resources and new missional ecclesial forms, it shouldn't be something that we're like this. It ought to be something where we're sharing in that. And so established churches with resources need, I want to encourage or foster a sense of new possibility. And those of us who are living out or practicing in these kinds of places to find ways to draw the resources and allow for there to be a mutual synergistic relationship between that which is slowly passing and what is emerging.
So Carson, I don't mean to turn this into a pop quiz, but could you, for anybody that's not read the book, could you kind of describe the 4 ecclesial forms that James describes in his research? If I give you the title, can you describe it?
I made a note, so I'd be ready for your question there.
Got it.
Thanks. Let me first say what James does is he goes to Seattle, he finds these 150 churches. He visits them, he has interviews with select pastors, he does survey work and blah, blah, blah. And out of all that comes 4 broad types that he sees in these new church plants in Seattle, Washington. And Todd, as Todd was noting, those 4 types are, one would be the Great Commission. What's the T stand for? GCT, Great Commission Teams. Yeah, Great Commission Teams, GCT. And then he notes another group that he calls the Household of the Spirit. And then the third grouping he calls Church's New Community. And the fourth he identifies as Neighborhood Incarnation. And if I were to go back through those 4 and say a word about them, I think that's what Todd was sort of hinting at, would be to say that what he sees in the first 3 are sort of new variations of something we've seen before. The Great Commission teams are church plants that are, it's sort of like evangelicalism part 2.0. It's, and I don't want to caricaturize in a negative way, but for the purposes of this conversation, it's a deep focus on gospel and salvation, and we need to do and be whatever it takes to save people's soul. And so we're going to get real relevant, we're going to get real practical, and we're going to get in people's lives and faces and feed them and do whatever we need to do so that we can tell and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. And evangelicalism, perhaps at its best. The word evangelical hardly has any meaning anymore. I don't know what to do with it, but that's the Great Commission team, and he sees a grouping of churches in that sort of framework. The second, household of the Spirit, is a way of describing what I would call Pentecostalism 2.0. That is to say, what does it look like when Pentecostal or charismatic traditions take to the streets and plant a church? These churches tend to be a little more culturally diverse or racially diverse, and would participate, are spirit-led churches. The third frame, the new community, church's new community, of which he says, I think if I remember right, about 10% of the churches fall into this category, are what I would call mainline Protestantism 2.0, which is to say, we're going to lean into the tradition and make it palatable and work out of the tradition in meaningful, relevant ways to engage with folk. The fourth category is neighborhood incarnation, and here I don't know that we've got anything quite analogous in American experience to get to it. This is where, for those of you who are aware of missional theology, he's going to he's putting his bets on this fourth category himself. And in fact, some people who read this say he went in biased and he came out biased. Maybe he did, I don't know. But I have to confess, I'm kind of lean toward this fourth category myself. So, and I'll sooner or later tell you some of the reasons why I think that makes most sense. But here, this gets back to the conversation Andy prompted a moment ago about local contextual engagement that is concerned for the whole person. It's not evangelicism, we're going to baptize them, we want to get them saved, nor is it social justice, which is sort of the new community. Let's find and attend to social issues. It's a both and. It's a holistic reality that you can't create a dichotomy between God's interests in a person's soul and what they eat for dinner tonight. Those things belong together, and the whole well-being, for example. And so these churches are churches that are local, they're contextual, and they practice hospitality, and they're engaged in service locally. And so one of the interesting things he notes, and this is why I find it fascinating myself, is that he says that Great Commission, Household of the Spirit, and the new community groups all are pretty distinct from each other. But when he looks at the fourth category of neighborhood incarnation, he's able to identify churches that are neighborhood incarnation, but who draw from or are connected to, in some way, the evangelical frame. And they're also connected to the Pentecostal frame, and they're also connected to the church's new community, mainline, or the great tradition frame. And by so doing, he's saying there's something more elastic about the notion of local, contextual, paying attention to your context, engagement missionally, that matters, that is able to draw from all of those resources. And that's part of why he, I think, leans that way. So, Todd, am I kind of getting what you'd like to get out on the table there with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I know at least a couple of folks on here have read or are reading the book. Kevin is one of those. Kevin, ask your question here. You're muted.
So one of my questions relates to I'm in chapter 7, so I'm just about done. And it's a fantastic book, so thanks for putting us onto it. My question is, I have an initial question, then I have a follow-up that kind of relates to what we're doing here in our church plant. The instrumentality that he identifies in the Great Commission team churches, where they do good deeds and they help the poor and they serve in the community in order to evangelize. So kind of I guess I'm curious about your assessment of that. But then also my question for us is so we've been planting here for nine years officially, with 3 years of prehistory, so 10 or 12 years. And I feel like we've been doing a lot of good for a long time, but we haven't been vocal enough about our faith. So how do this is a question for all of us, but how do we do social justice and compassion ministry without never bringing up the gospel, but also without the instrumentality of the Great Commission team model? There's an easy one for you.
Yeah, that's an easy one. Okay, now let's move on.
Alan said he'll answer it for us.
Yeah. Well, that's sort of the thing, isn't it? And it kind of boils back down to what is the identity of that community? What fundamentally what is our self-understanding really all about? Are we here to see people get dunked in water and get their souls saved, or however you would articulate that? Or are we a part of something truly bigger than, are we able to articulate what it means to be an extension of the kingdom of God? And so I think it comes back down to those kinds of questions for a community of faith. And I think we're always struggling with that, right? And because we're either so focused on social justice issues because they're real. First of all, they're real, and they make human connections. That then we somehow or another don't get around to the larger conversations about people's spiritual well-being, or the flip comes the other way, and we get into this two-sided thing. Is there some way for us to hold both of those things in a creative tension with each other and be very aware and intentional about the ways in which our social engagement is related to our desire to see people not just be fed well or have good housing, but also to live well in life with God? And how do we, this true full human flourishing, how do we keep both of those things in conversation with each other? I've not answered your question. I just really, and I don't know that I can, frankly. I think you're pointing out a dilemma. Sometimes I think the challenge is for us not to recognize that it's A or B, it's A and B. And whatever your journey, if your community in, Kevin, you're in Canada somewhere?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so wherever you're at, what is it that for us, and how do we keep those two things in creative tension with each other, which will be different than Orlando or Fort Worth or fill in the blank? That becomes a very live and hard question for you and your team of leaders.
And I think Kevin's question there speaks very much to where Mission Alive is and has been in recent years, as we've really tried to focus on planting churches in and for marginalized communities, believing that the church has at certain points in history been on the front end of leading societal change and speaking for those without a voice. And in our better moments, the church has been on the front edge of those things and needs to be again. And so how we do that, how we hold that tension becomes very important if the church is going to, in my mind, one of the ways for the church to regain credibility or voice or influence in a secular world is to step into those things. And we're not here to hear me talk, we're here to hear you talk, but I think it's that tension that we really have to hold on to. Let me take us back to the book for one more question, and then I want to kind of ask a more general question from you, Carson. But how would you evaluate it as the author closes this book? He does a final chapter with 5 what he describes threads of practical wisdom. And I kind of wanted to get your take on these threads of practical wisdom. Let me read them out, and then you kind of talk to us about which ones make most sense to you given your study and experience. This first one is to embrace local identity and local mission. Number 2 is cultivate embodied, experiential, everyday spiritualities. 3 is recognize community life as both witness and formation. Number 4 is prioritizing hospitality as the cornerstone practice. And the last one is discovering vitality in a diverse ecclesial ecology. Where do you fall in all that? Which of those kind of resonates with you?
Well, I utilize 4 of these in a lot of the work I do in consulting with churches. Most of my work is with established congregations. So I'm living in maybe a little different space than many of you are. But the first 4 of these are things that I talk a lot about. I think he's spot on with these threads. This idea of local identity, local mission. We've already given some time to that in this hour, right? I think the day is coming, and now is, that the neighborhood, the regional church or the citywide church will pass away. People are not going to drive across town just because you've got a great music program. That still will happen. It will, but that day is in decline. What people are going to, particularly secular folk that you all are interested in the work and the ministry you do, are going to be interested because you're in their neighborhood. You're down the street from them. You're helping them plant a garden or navigate social resources from the county government, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a church that engages in local ministry and mission and does that well is a part of a thread that I want people to pull on and lean into. Cultivating embodied, experiential, everyday spiritualities. I think there's value there too. The idea of sacred and profane is sort of another one of those false dichotomies. And so how do we understand how we ritualize even a common meal with one another? I'm not talking about the Lord's Supper during a worship service. I'm talking about the potluck meal afterwards being a place of worship and gathered community where we recognize each other in the community that's here as we gather around a common table. That prayer is something that's ordinary and a part of everyday life. There's a lot there, I think, for us to explore, and the tradition, I think, helps us a lot with that. Recognizing community life as witness and formation is sort of something that stumped me for a little while until I began to work with some work by Kevin Rowe. I think I'm spelling his name correctly. Somebody can look up. He's done some work. He's a Duke professor. He's done something on flourishing congregations. Somebody Google that and see what you come up with. There's a little workbook that he's done. What Kevin Rowe has done is look at the book of Acts and ask, what do I see in the flourishing communities of the primitive church? And one of the things that comes out of that is the robust way in which disciples are formed and made, and that when the church gathered, it wasn't just to worship, it was also to form people of faith. And so one of the things I've been discovering in my work in established churches, and you'll have to realize that I'm not talking about probably your context, but in established churches, I am astounded at the lack of depth of theological understanding and faith. People come to church because my grandpappy brought me to church. We have, I think I'm making a sweeping indictment here, we have illiterate people in our churches. And when push comes to shove, they can't make the argument that maybe wearing a mask is good for my neighbor. They think that the prior argument would be, I may get myself in trouble here with this, but the prior argument, the higher argument is my personal liberty, right? Well, how in the world could a Christian make that if they understand loving God and loving neighbor? Well, because we haven't formed them to think deeply Christianly. And so many of the declining churches that I'm in, I am seeing Christians who don't know what it means to be Christian. They don't understand the regula fide, the ancient creed. They don't know what makes for core the essentials of the Christian faith and how that plays itself out in life. So I'm saying all that, and I'm saying it way too long, I apologize, but to make the point that what Chris is trying to do in this book is to say that when we gather together, it is about public witness to the goodness of the gospel, but it's also a time of forming people to be deeply Christian. And it's that deeply Christian piece that I think we have neglected. We've assumed that people are Christian rather than formed them to be so. And if you're in a burgeoning new community, then forming people to be deeply Christian, I think you should not assume it. You've got to do it. And so I think he's helpful on that point. For hospitality, yes, prioritizing hospitality. All are welcome at this table. All are welcome in this room. And then the fifth thing he says about discovering vitality in a diverse ecclesial ecology, I don't think he knows what he's saying about that. I think I reread it again this afternoon. I still don't know what he means. I think what he means is that, one of the things he may mean is that his fourth point about being a neighborhood incarnational church is the best because it imbibes or brings in diverse ecclesial traditions into that space. So I don't know what, I ignored the fifth point myself.
That was my interpretation for whatever it's worth. And
Good.
I find younger leaders, they're not only not going to avoid other corners of the Christian world, they're going to intentionally seek it out, believing that there's something there to be gained. And so, if that's what he means, I think he's right on target with
that point. Yes, and I would agree. Yeah.
Well, as we move to wrap this up, let me ask just one last question. It's really a very broad question. Just out of your wisdom, knowledge, experience, what would you say to Mission Alive, to those in the Mission Alive world, that you think we need to kind of carry with us as we go about our work?
I'd say it's hope. Hope.
We're in short supply, or?
No, I'm saying the thing that we all, you and I, all of us, carry, the currency that we have to spend is hope. Hope in God's action in the world. Hope in God's commitment to redeem and transform the heaven and the earth. And that we've been invited to participate in that. And though life is challenging and difficult, what I say to leaders across the country is, don't forget hope, that what God started, he's going to finish, and he's invited us into that. And so whatever work you're doing, I'm still stewing over Kevin's question. I want to come at that question, Kevin, with hope, and lean into it, and know that if I and other leaders in my community are wrestling with that deeply, then something's going to emerge that's going to be good. Because God God always finishes what he starts. So that would be my word, Todd, is we act with hope and confidence in God's capacity, and with plenty of humility on our own parts for what God can and is doing with ordinary people across the country and across the world.
Well, Carson, I don't know that you know how important it was for you to turn me onto this book a year and a half ago. And as I told you in my email, I avoided emailing you because you said when I get done reading it, you want to talk about it. Well, it took me so long to get to it. I was sort of embarrassed. It has been a transformative book for me personally, and I have shared it out with the Mission Alive network, and I have been hearing back about its transformative power for many in our network. So thank you for that contribution that you didn't even know you made. So, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, just real quickly, the Kevin Rowe, that's a great commentary, but that's not the one I'm thinking about. It'll have the word flourishing. I think it'll have the word flourishing communities. It's just a little booklet. It'll be 70 pages, or you can download it with a Kindle app kind of thing. But I would think that many of you could make use of that little booklet. I can remember bits and pieces in my brain. I can never remember the full title. Maybe somebody will snag it here on.
I'm looking on Amazon. I'm not seeing it. I see One True Life, the Stoic Early Christians as Revival Tradition, Christianity Surprise, a Sure and Certain Hope, and Early Narrative Christology, the Lord and the Gospel of Luke. I'm seeing on...
or maybe it's Thriving. Maybe it's the word.
I found
thriving.
something under his name called Thriving Communities. I didn't follow up anymore, but
that's it. Thriving Communities. I'm sorry. Flourishing, thriving. Take your pick. But he has 6 simple points that he draws out of the book of Acts that would make a lovely presentation or something to work off of with a team of leaders, for example. I think you'd find it useful.
Carson, thanks for your time.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been fun talking with you.